Viewers often criticise us YouTubers and influencers for taking money from companies to shill product we'd never actually use ourselves. That's an utterly flawed argument for a number of reasons, but chief amongst them is that most of the gear that I use every day originally came in for a paid video. One such device I've been using continuously for the last 6 years is the Waza Tube Amp Expander. This is Boss's Lair, a Loadbox, Attenuator and IR loader. From the moment I first plugged this in, I genuinely could not understand how I possibly lived my life without it. My only complaints about this box are that it's large, heavy, expensive and packed full of features that I've never used. All of the useful features that this has that would be invaluable for a live performer are rather wasted on me. For over half a decade, I've been wishing Boss would supplement this with a smaller, cheaper version. Something more tailored to the home studio experience to make this incredible piece of equipment accessible to more guitarists who just can't justify that full fat price tag. So as you can imagine, I was thrilled to learn that Boss now offer this, the Tube Amp Expander Core. Smaller, cheaper and stripped of all non-essential features. This is the studio attenuator that I've been dreaming of for the last 5 years. The fact that Boss want to pay me to tell you all about it just means I'm doing my job with a little more enthusiasm than usual. I mean, not much more enthusiasm, of course. It is still work after all. Loadboxes, attenuators and IR loaders are now pretty commonplace in the guitar amplifier world. At this point, most guitarists will be very familiar with what they are and what they do. But there are always people discovering this technology for the first time, and Boss have asked me to refresh your memories and get you up to speed with the basics. Valve amplifiers require the correct impedance load in order to operate safely and efficiently. Under normal operation, the speakers provide that impedance load. Impedance is the electrical opposition to alternating current. The output transformer of the amplifier needs to see some opposition to the current it outputs to prevent damage. The voice coil of the speaker provides that opposition, and the amp and speaker function together as a complete circuit. With nothing to impede the current at output, the transformer, valves and surrounding components can be under incredible electrical stress and rising voltages, which can cause cascading failure as the components overheat and burn out. Although measured in ohms, impedance is a touch more complex than static resistance. There is a frequency-dependent component to impedance that can't be measured by simply sticking an ohmmeter across the speaker terminals. We talk about 8 ohm or 16 ohm loads, but these values are nominal. In reality, the impedance value is constantly evolving and changing with the frequency content of the signal. If we want to correctly mimic a speaker interaction, we need more than just a big resistor. We need to design something with a reactive impedance. The expander core is a reactive load box. It mimics the impedance relationship the amplifier sees from a speaker, allowing the user to operate a valve amplifier safely without a speaker cabinet attached. Different speakers and different cabinets react differently to an amplifier's output. The core takes this into consideration by providing 2 different 8 ohm load circuits. Combo, which approximates the reaction of a 1x12 open back combo, and stack, which approximates the reaction of a closed back 412 cab. While that's hardly the entire scope of cabinet and speaker arrangements, it does represent the 2 most common recording scenarios and is a much more streamlined approach than the mix and match resonance and presence knobs on the full fat expander, which I only ever use to swap between big cab versus small cab response anyway. Used in conjunction with the core's IR loader and XLR line out, we can record the sound of our amplifier reacting to an appropriate load of a simulated speaker cab without physically having to connect a speaker or set up a microphone. Making a valve amp sound really good often involves making it really loud, which might not be feasible under many circumstances. Loading down the amplifier for silent recording via XLR is one solution, but in practical terms it's often very useful to still be able to hear the amplifier through a speaker cabinet in the room while playing, which is where attenuating the output level of the amplifier becomes extremely useful. Attenuators are devices that sit between the amplifier and speaker, absorbing some of the energy output by the amp so that the speaker receives a smaller portion of it, retaining the full tone of a roaring cranked up amplifier, but at manageable volume levels for your studio space. Most attenuators do this in a stepped fashion, engaging different circuitry to knock down the output level in distinct chunks. The tube amp expanders, however, achieve continuous attenuation, allowing smooth, stepless volume reduction. The core does this by completely loading down the signal, absorbing essentially all of its energy and then re-amplifying it with a built-in 30-watt solid-state power amp that utilises Boss's tube logic approach, which, if I've correctly read between the lines of their marketing buzzwords, is a Class A/B power amp that uses DSP magic somewhere in the chain to achieve the nuances of high impedance valve interaction, things like crossover distortion and rectifier sag that you wouldn't typically get in normal solid-state power amps. Ultimately, what it means is that once the valve amplifier goes through the reactive load, the signal gets sent through the core's effects loop, picking up any effects pedals you've always wanted to place behind your amp but you couldn't because they'd explode, and then it goes through the onboard digital effects processor before finally being re-amplified to drive the speaker cabinet at whatever volume is appropriate for your application. The speaker cab can be used in parallel with the stereo XLR line outs and the IR loader, so your direct feed and your cabinet can be recorded simultaneously, or you can use the cabinet as an in-room or on-stage reference while the recording engineer receives only the direct feed. An impulse response, as the name suggests, is the response of a dynamic system to an impulse as a function of time. By mathematically analysing how the frequency content of a speaker being driven by a signal evolves over a finite time frame, we can essentially build out an EQ filter that replicates how a particular speaker, cabinet and microphone arrangement responds when a sound is passed through it, in order to apply that response to any signal we please. Armed with a host of IRs made from various different speaker and microphone arrangements, we can apply these to the line out of the expander core and have the sound of a particular speaker and microphone without physically having to connect or even own that equipment. Speaker IRs are incredibly useful things for situations where getting a speaker loud enough to record the sound with a microphone is impractical. It offers the flexibility of silent recordings that stretch on into the night, or controlled and feedback-free direct feeds for the front of house in a live situation. The expander core has a number of preloaded IRs to explore. 2 can be loaded up at once and blended together as either a mono or stereo feed. If you have any favourite third-party IRs that you're already using across your projects, these can be loaded into the core and saved as part of the rigs. In order to edit these rigs, you can either connect the core to your computer via USB and run the desktop software, which is a massive pain in the arse if you aren't already using this as an audio interface. I have a strict segregation rule for my equipment. Amplifiers shouldn't be allowed to mix with computers, but I will allow the occasional dalliance with Bluetooth apps. That's why I would highly recommend the optional Bluetooth receiver. I've got the core app installed on my iPad, which means if I ever need to make changes to the rigs, I can do so quickly without having to connect and disconnect a bunch of cables. I'm going to build out a speaker rig for a high gain amp tone using the core editor app. At the moment, this is the default settings. I'm using the built-in Celestian IRs. There's a list of them there. We're using 2 of them at once, blending them together into mono to get this sound. That's already an entirely usable sound, but perhaps I want to load in some of my own third-party IRs. So I go to the User IR tab, and I've got some loaded in here from 3 Sigma Audio. These are what I'm using most of the time when I'm recording guitar in the studio. So let's select some cabinets here. Let's try a Mesa Rectifier 412. And let's pair that up with a 212 cabinet. So let's choose perhaps the orange 212. That rectifier plus the orange sounds pretty great, but maybe we want to try something else. Perhaps a Marshall with, let's see, a Mesa 212. That often turns out quite well for me. That's sounding great, but we do have a lot of low end in there. We might want to process that out in a mix. Fortunately, we've got the Mix Assistant feature, which when engaged, cuts out some of the low end, some high end, does a little bit of EQ sculpting to try and make it a bit more mix ready. This is a personal preference thing. Maybe you want to do your own post-mixing, post-processing, but this does give you a little bit of a shortcut if you want it. Both of these IRs were created with the microphones slammed right up against the speakers, very close mic'd, so we don't get any room ambience from that. The airfeel is like a room mic sitting out in the room. We can blend in how much of that we want, and we can set the type for 2 different studio sizes, Studio 1 being a smaller space, Studio 2 being a larger space, and we can dial in to taste how much room ambience we want. In a high gain tone, probably not very much, but perhaps if we're doing something a little cleaner, more combo-y, a little bit of crunchy drive, a bit of room ambience is exactly what we'd need. We can actually mute out both of the cabinets here so that all we're hearing is the airfeel, getting the room mic only. So we just need to blend that into taste. Beyond this, we can move into the Editor tab to see the overall signal chain. At the moment, all we've got activated is the cab and mic, the IRs that we've been using. We can obviously turn those off if we wanted, and we'd get this, which is only good if you want to apply IRs in post. So let's turn that back on. Perfect. We can also add in some post effects here, compression, delay, and reverb. Turning the reverb on, we can jump into that menu, and I've got a little bit of a plate set up right now. A little tiny brightness on the tone, not too big a reverb. A little touch of plate's a nice thing to have, and we can also set up the reverb so it sends to the speaker but not to the direct feed if we wanted, or vice versa. So I've turned off to the line out here. Actually, let's turn off the airfeel completely so we can Hear what's going on? So that's dry as a bone. We can turn it on and get a little bit of plate. We can select the level here as well. You might not be a fan of reverb, but you might like a little bit of post-compression. This gives us a couple of rack-style compressors to play with. I've got this one set up pretty subtly, just to level out some of the heavy picking. And if you want to be using this as a lead sound, you can of course add some delay if you're not using a delay pedal in the effects loop of the core. In the delay menu, I'm using the SD3000 mode. We can also use analog stereo panning if we want to, but this is the one that I'm used to, and this is the one I like. And once I'm happy with what I've made, I can of course write this to the core, rig number 5, or any rig that I want, I'm going to go with number 5. And therefore that's saved to the rig now, so that I can disconnect this app, don't have to have the iPad anywhere near me, and it'll be saved to the rig setting on the core. I can change that knob to anything I want and always come back to rig 5 later on and get that sound again. Of course, the option also stands to turn off the IRs in the rig menu, letting you record the raw amp signal if you want the flexibility of changing the speaker sounds long after you've recorded the take. I've got my first 2 rigs set up in this fashion. One completely dry and one with delay, reverb and stereo compression. I can then use the IR loader in my DAW to select whatever cabinet sounds work with my current project. Using a Loadbox or attenuator is not a substitute for being sensible when operating your amplifier. Recently, there was an incident with a certain German YouTuber known for his colourful attire, where he bricked a very expensive and modified Plexi by running it into an attenuator for several hours with all of the knobs in the amp turned up to 10.
I'm a dumbass.
Henning knows fine well he's an idiot. He and I had a conversation about it, and frankly, he's lucky that all he damaged was a high-tension fuse installed specifically to protect the amp against the stupid thing that he did. But in him talking about it, how he damaged his amplifier, a lot of his viewers took the wrong message and started to recirculate a long-standing myth that using an attenuator can damage your amp or significantly shorten the life expectancy of your valves, going so far as to inundate manufacturers of attenuators with concerned emails and phone calls. So I want to reassure you that using an attenuator will not damage your amplifier, but you've still got to be sensible when you're using them. Running a valve amplifier at maximum volume for extended periods of time will put incredible strain on the internal components of the amplifier. They simply are not designed to be used that way, and any tiny little falter in any of the components when running under that kind of stress will have a cascading effect. Once one part starts to fail, the whole amp will fail very quickly and often very expensively. This is true with or without an attenuator. The only danger an attenuator poses is the hubris and false sense of security that you get because it allows you to do stupid things with your amp without the terrifying bone-shaking volume levels that would warn you against such actions. Attenuators will have a maximum power they are able to handle, 100 watts in the case of the core, but it's worth remembering that a 100 watt amp is perfectly capable of delivering significantly more than 100 watts, especially if you've maxed out the controls. It's safest to imagine the power output of an amp as the average power for the amplifier at its expected operating volume. Run it quieter, it'll output less power on average, but run it louder and it'll output more power on average. Consistently outputting above the maximum power handling of the attenuator will result in the attenuator overheating. The hotter it gets, the less power it's able to handle, and very quickly we'll find ourselves in a situation where your very loud valve amplifier is essentially running without a load attached, which will very quickly take down the amp. Attenuators are great for bringing down the volume of a loud amplifier to something more reasonable, but they don't provide you immunity from abusing your amp and thinking everything will be okay. So you've got to be sensible. Remember that running your amp at high volume levels puts strain on the amplifier and the attenuator. A Loadbox or attenuator is not going to damage your amp, but mistreating your amp certainly will. My only complaint with the core is that the first time you connect it to the Bluetooth app, it hits you with a message telling you to update the firmware. But the app gives you no instruction on how to do that. There's nothing in the app menu that lets you update the firmware, and you can't write any of the changes to the core without the update. So away I go, searching through the Boss website like Arthur Dent trying to find an important document in his local civic planning office, and when I finally found out how to do it, it turns out to be the most arse-backwards method of updating firmware I've ever seen. Using an arcane ritual of knob positions and button holds, the core can be powered on into USB flash drive mode. When connected to a PC, the update files, which are extracted from a zip folder downloaded from the support page on Boss's website, can be dragged onto the core. Once untethered from the PC, the core goes into flashy light mode for several minutes as it contemplates its mystical contents before finally turning green in acceptance of its new purpose. And of course, this process is not outlined to you anywhere in the provided user manual. You've just got to put on your big boy pants and search the website support page to discover it. This is the Dark Souls of firmware updates. Boss, you're selling this product to guitarists, a demographic with the average IQ of a damp sponge. There must be a more efficient, less inscrutable way to perform a firmware update. Why can't we transfer the update across Bluetooth from the app? Why do I have to perform a secret stonecutter handshake in order to have the computer recognise this as a storage drive? It just feels like an afterthought. How do we cram this into the already existing functionality rather than designing an intuitive, user-friendly way to accomplish the task? I absolutely love my original tube amp expander, and I love the core even more. This is exactly what I wanted when I gave my opinion 6 years ago. It's smaller, lighter, easier to use, still has all the essential functionality and connectivity. It's cheaper, which will please a lot of people. The full-size one is often more expensive than the amp you want to use it with. 30 watts is more than enough for studio use. The air feel and mix assist features for the line out add a lot of value, as does the ability to load in your own IRs. The digital effects are very handy as well in situations where I simply can't be arsed to connect physical pedals to the effects loop. It's amazing just how far a little reverb and post-compression can take a basic guitar tone. If you have a number of big valve amps that you want to use at home and record with, or even need a small, fully featured attenuator for some live session work to make your life easier, the Tube Amp Expander Core, add on the Bluetooth attachment, you'll wish you did it sooner. I genuinely could not do my job without it. Alright, that's all for now. Keep it loud. Stay safe.